We're very excited to have Dr. Julie Urban and Dr. Holly Shugart from the Department of Entomology at Pennsylvania State University, and they will be giving us some updates on current research on spotted lanternfly. So thank you so much.
Okay, thanks for having me today. Today I'm going to talk to you about some research I've been doing trying to understand adult body weight and how that is correlated with survival trends on selected specialty crops. Also notice how here this insect has a number written on it. That's one of the ways that we were able to track the changes in weight over time during the course of this experiment. Okay, so you guys probably know that spotted lanternfly is a highly prolificous, meaning it feeds on a lot of plants, invasive insect. And we find that their survival is variable on different hosts. We wanted to better understand host plant impacts on spotted lanternfly body condition, and we used their weight, and their weight changes during the course of the experiment. We hoped and found that this would provide an additional dimension of the pest-host relationship, more than just did they survive or not, right? Also going to touch really briefly on a couple of hosts where we tested nymphal survival. This is really important as spotted lanternfly spreads to new areas. They're going to encounter new types of hosts. Can they survive on these hosts? That might increase the risk of establishment in that habitat, especially can they survive to adult? And that will greatly increase the risk of their spread because then they can fly. So first experiment here. We measured adult female weights and tracked their survival on 7 specialty fruit hosts and compared that to Tree of Heaven or Ailanthus. So 50 insects per on 8 hosts. These are forced feeding assays. We did not give them a choice. And we calculated percent survival at each time point and total days survived. And then we did a regression analysis comparing the link between weight gained or lost and survival duration. So here's our first plot. This is a Kaplan-Meier survival plot. We've got percent surviving on the host by days survived at the bottom. And the solid line here represents the actual data. The dashed line is the 95% confidence interval. And the hosts we looked at are over here. We looked at avocado, 2 different varieties of hops, fuzzy kiwi, grapevine, that's Vitis vinifera, Sauvignon Blanc, muscadine grapes, that was Black Beauty variety, sweet orange, Valencia, and we compared that to Tree of Heaven. On most of the hosts, they died before 10 days, and these drops off to here to 0. But on fuzzy kiwi, grapevine, and Tree of Heaven, they survived between 25 and 40 days. These are kind of the same data presented a little differently. We've got days survived here, and then each host plotted. And the boxes represent the median 50% of the data. Most of them, it's pretty low, right down here, less than 10 days. Interestingly, fuzzy kiwi, most of the insects had died before 5 days, right? But we had some outliers that survived to 26 days. Grapevine, most of them survived between 0 and 20 days, but we had some insects that survived to 40 days. Tree of Heaven, a little bit of loss before 20 days, but most of them survived to between 20 and 30 days. And then looking at weight changes and how that tracks with survival, we found them to be strongly correlated. So we've got weights here and the weight change over time because we took their initial weight and then tracked them throughout the experiment to the end. And then we've got the different hosts here and their survival. So here is 0. So these insects on these hosts lost weight, insects on these hosts gained weight. And we found that 82% of the weight changes could be explained by host species. And we found that on Ailanthus, that's Tree of Heaven, they gained 7% of their body mass. On grapevine, 13%. Looking down here at the insects that lost weight, noticeably on citrus, they lost 41% of their body mass and all died within 5 days. So really, really different outcomes according to host. Okay, quickly talking about some nymphal data. We looked at nymphal survival on citrus and avocado. We bagged them on the trees, as you can see here, 50 insects per 8 reps for each experiment. Our Kaplan-Meier plot here is a little simpler, right? Very extreme drop. All of the insects had died by day 10 for avocado, which is in red. And orange, that's citrus, they didn't start dying until about day 85, and between 85 and 95 days. So they survived for 95 days as nymphs and only survived for 5 days as adults. Really different outcomes. Looking at the avocado and citrus comparison, average of 5 days versus an average of 93 days. And importantly, and this is the first time this has been demonstrated, we found that the nymphs could complete their life cycle on citrus. And we only had one adult male emerge at day 68. So they mostly got to fourth instar, stayed at fourth instar, which is their final instar before becoming an adult. And we only had the one that made it to adulthood. So that was a really interesting outcome. Okay, so pest-host interactions are incredibly complex in this highly prolificous insect. These differences can be really dependent on life stage. The example I'm giving here is citrus, where the adults lost 41% of their body mass and died within 5 days, but the nymphs were able to survive for 95 days. And we feel that body weight is an appropriate proxy for body condition, can be used to demonstrate host suitability. And that is all I have. My email is there if you have questions, and I'm going to pass it off to Julie.
Thanks, Holly. So my talk today is kind of building on this idea that Holly talked about. When you have an insect that can feed on so many different plants, basically, as it expands its range, we're trying to understand how those impacts might change when it moves into new areas. And so here, this is a great map from New York State IPM. That's the distribution of spotted lanternfly as of this year. And so you can see it's been expanding. But two things in the context of what's bugging you, all right? Two things really jump out to me as someone who's been working on lanternfly since it got here. And one of those things is that it's moving latitudinally, it's moving south. And so you see it expanding down. We have populations in North Carolina. An additional county has been added in Tennessee. And actually, I think I have in here, we have additional counties were added in Pennsylvania just this year to the quarantine. And the other thing that really stands, and I'll talk more about the Southern movement in a second, but the other thing that stands out to me in looking at this map is how this fits with areas of grape production. Because one of the things that we know with spotted lanternfly in terms of impacts from growers, but also from a lot of field and laboratory experiments, is that it can feed on a lot of different things, but two things that it's feeding can significantly damage and even kill is tree of heaven and grapevines. And so the impacts to grapevines we've observed in southeastern Pennsylvania and New Jersey, Maryland, in areas where lanternfly has infested, been an infestation for the longest. But here you can see that as it moves up into New York, you might see it very commonly. You've seen it in New York City since at least 2021, but it's just now, it's not really getting into vineyards in the Hudson Valley. It's just really not yet getting into, or just beginning to get into, vineyards out on Long Island, and really isn't in the Finger Lakes growing region. It's not really in this Erie area. I'll come back to that. It's just starting to move into some of the more major vineyards in Virginia. And so basically trying to predict its impacts as it expands to these new areas is really a big problem. And so as it expands to new areas, everything Holly, why we're doing the host suitability testing that she's been conducting, is that as it moves into new areas, it's going to encounter and likely feed on different crops. So it might feed on different specialty crops. And so even though adults don't do great in citrus, if lanternfly gets out to California, it might do well enough on citrus as nymphs to traverse traverse the citrus and, you know, survive long enough to get to what it really wants, which are grapes. Other impacts, as it expands south, one of the things that I've been working on myself is looking at changes in the timing of spotted lanternfly reproductive development. And so this is data from 2 years ago, and I did this again last year. I did like kind of head-to-head collections. I collected lanternfly, you know, August 19th up here in Pennsylvania, and road tripped it down to Kernersville, North Carolina, and collected. Did the same thing, collected adult females and weighed their body mass and did dissections and looked at how mature they were reproductively inside. Did they have eggs? Were they mated? That kind of thing. Did the same thing in September, and the population kind of tanked at the sites where I was collecting in North Carolina, so I wasn't able to get a collection in North Carolina in October. But basically, this is that body mass over time. And what you can see is that the individuals in Pennsylvania developed more slowly, were exposed to cooler temperatures than in North Carolina. So you can see that at the same time, you know, in August, the females were a month ahead, in a sense, of size-wise of what we see up here. And so what this means, and you can see the insects, this is a collection from September in North Carolina. You can see their abdomens aren't very expanded, but they certainly are at the same time very expanded in North Carolina with some degree of variation. And so if they might lay eggs sooner, you know, we think that maybe day length and whatnot influences the actual egg laying. But basically, if they're kind of adults sooner, since they are adults sooner in southern regions, the adults are the heaviest feeding stage. Are they going to feed heavier and feed longer and really hit plants, especially when they get into grapes? They're not into grapes yet in North Carolina, but are they going to do more damage? And are they going to potentially even feed heavier and also lay more egg masses or more fit egg masses? So we might see a change in the impacts with these biological changes in lanternfly development. But back to this issue here. Right now, we don't have lanternfly in this Lake Erie grape growing region, but it's knocking on the door. Okay. And so when we try to predict these impacts, we can't really, you know, I'm a biologist, so you tend to think about biological things, but there's other things, you know, so things like, you know, temperature, plant, you know, host plant feeding, that kind of stuff. But there's other things that are going to potentially change the impacts that lanternfly has in new areas. So in that Lake Erie growing region, that's one of the largest Concord juice grape producing regions of the US. So there's larger vineyards. There's over 32,000 acres between Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio. Concord juice grapes, is sugar levels in those grapes is really important. We know lanternfly tanks sugar levels. And so is that going to have a big impact on juice production? Because it hasn't hit juice production grapes so far. Besides the fact that they grow a different kind of grape there, the profit margins for those growers is lower. You make less on an acre of juice grapes than you do on an acre of wine grapes. And so with those lower profit margins, are they going to be able to afford additional insecticide sprays to manage spotted lanternfly? And hopefully, you know, a lot of there are folks working, especially at APHIS. Hannah Broadley's leading some wonderful work that's very promising on biological control agents, a wasp that attacks lanternfly nymphs and lays their eggs in those nymphs. I think that's going to really pay off, but that's not going to happen for a few more years. So in the meantime, we're heavily reliant on sprays for management for lanternfly, and that might really do a number on growers there. The other thing is when it comes to decisions about spraying, where lanternfly is right now to date, those growers are not members of cooperatives. They use their grapes, they sell them maybe to someone else or make wine themselves. But the growers of these large vineyards in the Erie region grow for cooperatives like Gallows or Welch's. And if you don't follow their rules, they don't have to take your grapes. And so Gallows, sends some of their grapes to the European Union for wine production. And so basically that's a game changer potentially. And also in these large vineyards, they use mechanized harvesters, whereas where lanternfly is today, they use the hand pick. So you can just not pick the lanternfly. And so here we did a worst case scenario. We asked a grower who had a mechanized harvester in an infested vineyard, in eastern Pennsylvania, please don't spray the grapes. He offered them to us and said, okay, worst case scenario, would lanternfly get into grapes collected by a mechanized harvester, as opposed to being scared away from the noise? And yes, they could get in. So the issue of contamination could be real. So anyway, with that, as lanternfly expands, we need to maintain our vigilance, but we also need to get input and crosstalk with people in other agencies and in other positions to make sure we're prepared and for what might happen. Okay, so with that, I'll stop the show, and if we have time for questions.
We do have time for questions. Thank you so much, Holly and Julie, for that great information. I do invite folks to put your questions in the chat, and please include general questions too, even if it wasn't about a topic they covered, because you have an opportunity to ask some great questions of some spotted lanternfly experts. And we have one question so far. Would you expect differences in susceptibility to sprays for the insects collected from Pennsylvania versus North Carolina based on their difference in size? And then how much would you need more treatments maybe to control them?
That's a great question. Basically, a lot of things, it's kind of easy to kill lanternfly, and a lot of different products will do so. So I don't expect that necessarily you would need to increase the amount of product applied in any spray, but with that increased time window, I think that's the much more worrisome factor, because you're limited in the number of applications you can make of any given product. And so if you have to manage that across a longer time window, that's where you might have to resort to the use of other chemicals. That's where things get dicey, frankly. That's what I'm worried about.
For vineyards who invite tourists to visit, maybe they have a tourism component, how much of a risk is the potential for spotted lanternfly introductions from visitors driving in?
I think that's exactly also what we're worried about, right? And so in the Erie region, if you look on a map and look up where Presque Isle is, that's the most frequented park in the state of Pennsylvania. There've been a lot of detections of lanternfly. And so we're really worried about that. So that's why there's so much public awareness. And, the Stomp It campaign, that type of thing. Penn State, we have APHIS funding for billboards right there in that area. So yes, I think that's a main reason of concern. And that's something that why we're really, again, for Long Island and the Finger Lakes and Hudson Valley vineyards too.
Yeah. Someone is asking, they've heard that we're seeing a decrease in numbers of spotted lanternfly in areas where there were a lot of them. Do you know why that is?
I mean, it could be, it's not going to last. Where there's a lot of different reasons why that could be the case. Just, like that wave really explodes. They probably deplete the host plants, and then then their numbers would drop. Also changes between like drought years. That's something that we think might be going on. But basically we've seen a resurgence, especially in vineyards that were hit really heavily starting in 2018. And we're dealing with that now. And so even though it might, populations go down, they do come back up again. And so keep vigilant.
There's a really general question. What is the current relationship with Tree of Heaven? And I don't know if this is maybe getting at, having looked at all of these different hosts, what do we currently understand about the importance of Tree of Heaven for spotted lanternfly, maybe?
It's a highly preferred host in, lab experiments. It survives best on it. It's, but basically it in its native range in China, there's SLF populations where there isn't any Tree of Heaven. So it's likely really important for it to become established. It's likely an important food resource. But basically it's useful for like different places have looked at Tree of Heaven removal. That's not been empirically tested, and that's the feasibility of that is its whole issue in its own right. That could be a whole talk in itself. But basically using it as a trap tree or using it as a tree for monitoring is useful.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time, both Holly and Julie, for joining us today. And we're going to transition over into our IPM Minute. If you have lingering spotted lanternfly questions, drop them in the chat. We'll try to get some answers for you. Brian Brown, Dr. Brian Brown, is giving our IPM Minute today on wild parsnip. Brian is the integrated weed management specialist with Cornell IPM. Go ahead, Brian.
Great, thanks, Samara. Yeah, so this is near and dear to me. I have a lot of wild parsnip in the fields behind my house, and it's a real issue because it causes what we call phytophotodermatitis. So when the sap touches your skin, it causes a reaction that makes your skin especially sensitive to the sun. So it basically gives you a very strong sunburn. And there's gruesome photos you can find online if you're interested. But yeah, if you get exposed, you want to immediately cover it from sunlight and then get indoors and wash it off thoroughly, as well as any clothes that might have been exposed. And then for identification, let me find my laser pointer. Great. So these types of flowers are called umbels, and they're kind of like umbrellas. So wild parsnip has a flat umbel, and the largest umbel is on the main stem, and then off to the sides, coming off these side stems, are smaller umbels, and you can see that in this back plant here, the main stem, and then these smaller ones coming off to the side. The leaves are a lot like celery or parsley, which are in the same family. They're doubly serrated, kind of a yellowish green. And actually, this is one leaf. So it's a compound leaf with usually around 5 leaflets. There's many lookalikes in the parsley family, and I'll ask Amara to put into the chat a link to this resource as well as the Cornell resource on how to distinguish between various lookalikes. But really, a lot of these cause the phytophotodermatitis or are toxic, with the exception of wild carrot listed here. And all of these are biennials that spread only by seed. So the management is kind of similar. And the main thing is you really want to prevent the seed production. So pulling it out, hand pulling can be effective as long as you're fully suited up with personal protective equipment. Especially in wet conditions when the soil is loosened. Mowing works okay, but it can take a few years to really work, and there's a higher risk of exposure to the sap. So it's usually recommended that folks go the herbicide route using a systemic product and applying that in the rosette stage. So here in the fall, or in mid-spring, early bolt stage, and at that time you'd have both second year and first year plants present. But when you're clearing land with herbicides, it's important to kind of promote the plants that you want at the same time, so you're not left with bare space that the weed would come back into. So yeah, I would encourage you to get involved. Amara, if you could put another link into the chat there with where you can post your sightings of this weed as well as other invasive weeds on IMAP Invasives. get involved with the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, or PRISMS. And then New York State DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, has a program, not for wild parsnip, I don't think, but for its cousin, giant hogweed, that they'll come out and remove those or control them. So yeah, I'll take any questions now.
Great, thank you, Brian. Oh, we've got a great question here. Golden Alexander, which is a favorite plant of mine, Zizia aurea, is very similar in appearance to wild parsnip, but is a very valuable native plant. So the question is the bloom time the best way to distinguish them?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm not as familiar with Golden Alexanders, but I don't think it quite has that same umbel type shape. And at least if you're looking at the flowers, the wild parsnip again has this flat topped umbel, like someone gave it a buzz cut, and I don't think that's the case with the Golden Alexanders.
But the wild parsnip does bloom like later June around here.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Okay. I can confirm I grow a lot of Golden Alexanders in different places, and in central New York at least, it blooms in May, starts in early May, blooms through May. So some of that timing may be a difference as well.
Okay, great.
And then quick question, if you remove the plants, how should you dispose of the plant material?
Yeah, so this is an invasive species, so you certainly you're not allowed to move any living plant material, but I think dead plant material would be fine. Seeds are another issue. I guess I would maybe just compost it on site. One way that you can be sure that the plant material is dead is if you put it on like your driveway and then cover it with clear plastic to kind of let the sun solarize and kill it fully. But otherwise, the seeds, you could potentially bag them and just throw them out as long as they were maybe doubly sealed. I think that would be okay from a DEC regulatory perspective.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for this important information. And thank you everyone for being here today.